Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you again for joining us on this latest edition of our ASMEA webinars. I am Asaf Ramarowski, the Executive Director of ASMEA, and this afternoon we have the privilege and honor to host Neetu Arnold. Neetu is a Senior Research Associate at the National Association of Scholars, NAS. She's focused on university finances and past research, and she is a graduate of Cornell University. Recently, she authored the title of our webinar this afternoon, which is the title of her report, entitled Hijacked Middle East Study Centers Captured by Activists. All of us who obviously care about this field within the association know that we have also done a great deal of work on the state of Middle East studies. And obviously, this is also a timely an important topic that we're tackling, especially on the heels of our upcoming conference that is scheduled to take place on the weekend of November 5th. So, of course, I look forward to seeing everybody there in person. Hopefully, this will be this is our first conference in person, all in person. Last year we did hybrid, tackling a lot of these issues, and we hope to see you there. We will continue to tackle the issues. A few housekeeping issues before we start. Neetu will talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll go into Q&A. If you have a question, and we encourage you to ask as many as possible, please type in your question in the Q&A, and we will read it out loud. We will do our best, as always, to get to all the questions. If we don't, please feel free to email us afterwards, and we'll do our best to respond in a timely fashion. So without further ado, Neetu, thank you for joining us, and the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for that introduction. When I was first approached to look into this issue, I was thinking, how can I add something new to this topic? Because there were so many people before me who sounded the alarm on the bias of Middle East study centers. If we go all the way back to the 70s and 80s, there were concerns of Arab influence at Georgetown's Arabic Studies Center. And these concerns led to Congress adopting the foreign donation disclosure requirements in the Higher Education Act of 1986. Several years later, Martin Kramer released Ivory Towers on Sand, where he warned how these centers failed to not keep up with the major developments in the region, especially with Islamic extremism. Sandra Stotsky, who had worked for the Massachusetts Department of Education, had also detailed the bias of K-12 programming at Harvard's Middle East Studies Centers. And there are plenty of other people who sounded the alarms throughout the 2000s. But much of these criticisms occurred in that decade. And so when I approached this project, I had a couple of questions that I was interested in answering. I wanted to know, how have these centers changed? What do they promote compared to what they promoted 20 years ago? And to what extent is foreign influence still a concern at these centers? So I embarked on this mission through two methods, providing case studies and providing an extensive data analysis of all Middle East National Resource Centers, which are federally funded centers. So I compiled 7 case studies. These universities include Harvard, Georgetown, Yale, the University of Arkansas, George Mason University, the North Carolina Consortium, which consists of a partnership between the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and Duke University, and finally, the University of Texas at Austin. And these schools were chosen based on a variety of factors. I wanted to have a mix of public and private universities, elite universities like Harvard and Georgetown versus maybe not so elite universities like George Mason University. I also wanted universities which had national resource centers such as that at UNC and Duke, and centers that were not national resource centers that were primarily started through foreign donations, such as the Al-Walid bin Talal centers at Harvard and Georgetown. And I also wanted to include, I wanted to see if there was any difference between centers that are primarily Saudi funded, such as those at the University of Arkansas, Harvard, Georgetown, and centers which were a little different. They were funded through different donors. George Mason University's startup funds were primarily from a Turkish donor. So I wanted to account for all these differences and see if there were any changes, any similarities. And so the findings from my analysis, it still keeps up with many of the criticisms that were there in the 2000s, that these centers are still biased. They still are quite anti-Israel. You know, I actually visited some of these schools, and at the University of Arkansas, on one professor's door, there was a poster or a comic strip, and it essentially likened Israel to the KKK, which, you know, that was a little bit shocking for me to see, because when you look at other departments, you don't necessarily see those kind of posters. And that's actually in our report. You can see that picture in our report. But there were a couple of other things that were quite biased about these centers. It's specifically really bad when it comes to K through 12 programming. For example, a teacher fellows program, which was sponsored by the Middle East Study Center at the University of North Carolina, had teachers create curriculum that they could then share with their classroom, that they could then implement in their classrooms, and it's also a resource for other teachers. One of these lesson plans had students, would require students to receive a quick read of Shakespeare's Othello, just for character familiarity and the plot. And then they would discuss implicit biases and Islamophobia. At the University of Texas at Austin, their Middle East Studies Center contributed instructional material on critical race literacy. So these are just a couple of examples where the centers continue to promote biased materials and information. But the thing about case studies is that they can give a lot of in-depth information about individual universities, but it's often a little difficult to say, well, is this a trend across all universities and across time? And I wanted to actually see if that was the case. So I decided to conduct an extensive data analysis using Department of Education data for Middle East National Resource Centers. And just as a reminder, National Resource Centers were founded in the 1950s with the purpose of strengthening American national security by ensuring that Americans received more language education and knowledge about different areas of the world. But what I've been finding is that these national resource centers have now devolved from that purpose, and they've really just become more of these activist centers. So my data analysis looked at all Middle East national resource centers between 2000 to 2019, 2020. And I'm actually going to, I think the best way to talk about these and to show you what I mean is to show some slides with the data and to look at some of the analyses that I conducted. I was able to look at what these centers were covering, what their topics of interest were over time. And I want to describe how I conducted these analyses and what we're learning from these centers. So basically, I used all these national resource centers will conduct outreach programs, whether that's teacher training workshops or events. And so I used outreach program titles, and I decided to come up with some topics that were relevant to Middle East studies. So some of these topics include terrorism, climate change, immigration, and so forth. And so with each topic, I created a list of words that were relevant to that topic. So for example, you see an image here for terrorism. Words that might be associated with this topic would include terrorism, terrorist, Al-Qaeda, jihad, and so forth. And so, as I said, each topic, create a list of words, and then I checked each title to see if at least one of these words would appear. And if it did, that meant that this title is a terrorism related topic, or another title might be a climate change related topic. And so after conducting all of this, I calculated the percentage of programs in each year that matched at least one of these words. And so right here, we have the percentage of Middle East National Resource Centers outreach programs related to terrorism between the years 2000 to 2019. And so we see around 2001, there's a spike in terrorism related outreach programs, which makes sense. That was the era of 9/11. And then over time, it decreased. And so we see a decreasing trend in terrorism. Another topic I decided to look into is the coverage of Israel and Palestine, since this is a major issue in Middle East studies, and it often tends to be a contentious one. So pre-2005, we see that there's a lot of coverage in the Israel-Palestine issue. It's nearly at 10% in between 2000 and 2005. And then over time, it decreases significantly to about 4% in the late 2010s. And I still want to say that even though we see this decrease, the 4% is still significant across all the national resource centers and the various topics, but it decreased over time. And I think what's significant about this finding is that it does reflect, in some ways, it kind of mimics what we've seen with news coverage data on this, where the Israel-Palestine issue has decreased in coverage over time. I think another, if I'm speculating here, maybe another reason for why we see a decrease in the coverage of Israel-Palestine is because many of these Middle East study centers have received quite a bit of scrutiny for their coverage, their biased coverage of Israel-Palestine. They tend to be more sympathetic to Palestinians and more critical of Israel. And I think the increased scrutiny meant that they wanted to back away from that topic. So that could be another reason for this decrease over time. Now, if there's been a decrease in national security related topics such as terrorism and issues such as Israel-Palestine, that also means the centers are focusing on some other issues more. And one of those issues was immigration. We see that around 2000, it's around 1% of the coverage. And then over time, it increases and it spikes, particularly in 2015. This was during this era, we're seeing a lot of immigration from Muslim majority countries into Western countries, whether that be America or in Europe. And there's a lot of discussion over immigration and refugee policies, whether the Western countries should have to accept these immigrants or the refugees. So that would explain why there's a spike, and it's nearly like it's a little bit above 4% in 2015. And even though it drops post 2015, it is still double what it was in 2000. And so I'm gonna, oh, okay, here we go. So those graphs showed us that there's less focus on national security related issues and more on social issues. And this particular image here shows us, it basically confirms what we found in the outreach program data. Bar graphs on the left side, which are in red, are words that are more predictive of programs that were conducted in the earlier years, and those in blue would be more predictive of later year programming. So what we see is that in the earlier years, there was a lot of focus on issues such as Islam, Iraq, terrorism, very national security focused issues. But by the time we get into the later years, they drop many of the national security related topics, and they opt more for social issues, issues that are more concerned with global issues. So we see one word that's very predictive of the later years is MENA, which is more properly Middle East and North Africa. So that's sort of a shift in the scholars' interest in including North African countries, which tend to have some ties to Islam, but it historically wasn't necessarily considered part of the Middle East proper. So it demonstrates that there's a shift, that they want to expand their focus that isn't just on Middle Eastern countries. We also see words such as global, that is more predictive of programming from later years, refugee, COVID. COVID stuff was a major topic in 2020. We also see Islamophobia has become a more prevalent issue or relevant issues for these centers. And so that demonstrates a shift from national security to more social issues for these centers. So that's one area that I was interested in looking into, which was just what are these centers focused on? What are their programs focused on, and what kind of topics they'd like to emphasize more over the years. But another topic that's often come up with these centers is the level of foreign influence. I mean, Georgetown and Harvard in the mid-2000s received I believe $20 million donations from Al-Walid bin Talal in Saudi Arabia. And so there are concerns of whether these countries are trying to affect our foreign policy. So I decided to see if the level of foreign influence was the same across national resource centers versus privately funded centers. And what I found was that foreign influence today at these centers is not distributed the same. Some centers receive more of it, some centers receive more foreign donations, and some do not. And what you see here is a look at UCLA's Middle East Study Center donations between 2001 to 2020. During this time, they received a total of $1.78 million. The bulk of the donations came from individuals. And individual donations could range anywhere from $5 to $20. And many of these people are probably interested in these centers or interested in the UCLA Center because of cultural reasons. But two major donations came from one individual. It was a professor who is giving hundreds and thousands of dollars. And so that's how we have over $800,000 from individual donors. The second largest donations came from foreign governments. Now, I want to note that the amount from foreign governments, this is mostly from pre-2005, and the bulk of the foreign government donations came from the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. So what this tells us is that at least at a center like UCLA and probably many other Middle East National Resource Centers, they are not getting so much attention from the Middle Eastern countries. But I do want to note that the distribution of foreign donations is not the same across all universities. Georgetown, Harvard are definitely getting more foreign donations than some of these other centers. I'd also like to note that foreign influence can look different across these centers. At Georgetown, and it can affect the intensity of what they teach. So at Georgetown, for example, they have the Bridge Initiative, which is under the Al-Walid bin Talal Center. And Bridge Initiative basically focuses on Islamophobia, and they kind of run this blog, which is equivalent to SPLC's Hate Watch blog, where anybody who is considered Islamophobic or critical of Islam is placed on that list. So that would be an example where Georgetown is a little bit more extreme on those issues than maybe UCLA. I'd also like to note that at UCLA's Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, which is also a National Resource Center, their advisory board consists of members who are representative of foreign governments in the Middle East. And that presents a conflict of interest because these national resource centers are supposed to help American national security. And at times it's possible that these governments may have interests aligned with America, but there are also times where that is not the case. And so that would present a conflict of interest. So just to wrap up this point, basically, when it comes to foreign influence, at least today, many of the national resource centers may not be receiving the level of foreign funding that they did in the early 2000s, whereas centers that were funded in centers that were primarily received foreign funding from the start could still be getting those funds, and they tend to be the intensity in which they have the bias and teach, it's a little bit more intense. This was just a sneak peek of what our report presents. We conduct in-depth data analysis, and we also provide case studies. And I'd like to note with the case studies that we also rely on data sets, on archives of individual schools to provide more of a historical analysis of where these the inspiration behind finding these centers, and some of the key decisions that were made that may not be known. So I do hope that you'll take a look at the case studies, and the data analysis really just allows us to make broader generalizations that may not always be apparent with the case studies. And so we have these two methods of analysis. And so there were a couple of recommendations that we have in order to address some of the issues that we found. For one, universities should not have advisory board members who represent interests of foreign governments. That's a clear example where there could be a conflict of interest, and especially when it comes to American national security, we can't afford that. Another recommendation that we have is that university foundations should be subject to public information laws. At George Mason University, for example, I found that they failed to report $3 million from their Turkish donor. And they claimed that they didn't need to report those funds because it went through the George Mason University Foundation, which is technically separate from the university, but this foundation really acted as a pass-through for the money that it essentially benefited George Mason University. And so university foundations should be subject to those public information laws for accountability purposes. Another recommendation that we have is that for universities should be required to report foreign donations of at least $50,000. Currently, the law requires universities to report at least $250,000 per year from foreign governments, but oftentimes smaller donations can have a larger impact. And we really want to know the full extent to which foreign governments are having an influence at these centers. Again, I did say earlier that not all of these centers may be receiving foreign donations at this point, but we don't know for sure the full extent because there's some accountability issues and problems with the law where it becomes difficult to determine exactly where those sources are coming from. So I would say those are a couple of the solutions we have. And I do hope all of you will go read the report. It was quite enlightening to put together, and I do hope it adds more information, useful information to what's already out there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Neetu, so much. I mean, and thank you for taking the, obviously you've unearthed a lot of issues that many of us are aware of, and obviously, drilled even deeper as to the challenges that we're facing today and how it impacts foreign funding at large. I have a lot of questions, but I don't want to take away from people who joined us this afternoon. But let me start off. I know Alex has a first question, and then after that, we'll turn over to Suzanne, who will moderate the Q&A from the audience. So Alex, take your first shot, and we'll take it from there.
Sure. Thanks very much for the presentation and for the report, which is really terrific, and it really brings us up to date on a situation that's much more dynamic than I think a lot of people realize. The thing that was striking to me, having observed these issues very closely for 20 years, unfortunately, is how opportunistic colleges and universities, in particular these centers, are in terms of their shifting emphases, and that they'll go after the money, and they'll go after the trends within broader culture and society. And I would simply also put as a kind of aside that there are very interesting parallels that need to be discussed regarding China and its relationship with the American Academy, which is in some ways even deeper and more destructive than what you've documented. But let me get to my question, and that is the impact of these centers on, let's call it, broader society through their outreach and training missions. All of these centers provide curricular materials and lectures and education for K through 12 education and teachers generally, and local folks. And I was wondering whether you could talk about the emphases that are being seen today as opposed to those of 10 or more years ago.
Yes, so I think a lot of the emphasis is now on power dynamics and relationships, the oppressed versus, or sorry, the oppressors versus the oppressed. And usually Western countries or countries like Israel are seen as the oppressors, and the victim groups are those that are oppressed, that are minority groups. And I think this is actually, again, the lesson plan I shared with UNC, and their emphasis of, instead of teaching students about Shakespeare's Othello, like in like what we would consider that would be more appropriate, instead students are not even reading the full book. They are just receiving a brief outline of it, just for character familiarity and plot familiarity, and then they will look into more implicit biases, Islamophobia, and I think that's a bit problematic. Um, I would also say that the emphasis is more on, incorporating elements of critical theory into these courses. And at least with the teacher training programs, like, I don't think it is so much about presenting to students like national security or what is actually happening in those countries. I mean, there was one, this is again at UNC, there was a PowerPoint slide where the it told the teachers or whoever was presenting the materials, when it came to the hijab, for example, students might point out, isn't the hijab oppressive? And the teacher might acknowledge, yes, it is, but then they will shift the topic and say, but oppression has happened throughout history, and it tries to make it seem as if women in different cultures wear veils, and it's just not unique to Islam, and it ignores the fact that it's kind of unique in today's context. It's not that this didn't happen before, but women from other societies have never been oppressed, but it's more that they tried to take the attention away from what's happening right now. And so I think that's it. I'm hoping I'm answering this question, but basically there's a lot of programs that are more focused on making Islam or making some of these countries seem nice, and there's more focus on the perceptions rather than just what is happening.
Great. Thank you for that. All right, Suzanne, I'm going to turn it over to you. I know we have a bunch of questions in the chat, and if we have more time, we'll go back to more questions on this side as well. So, Suzanne, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Okay, our first question is from Ben Schachter, and he writes, might I ask that like 9/11 influenced talk on terrorism, President Trump's thought to vet immigration from specific countries might inform that spike in talk on immigration? Do you see that in the data, or is it more of a general uptick over time?
So I'd say it's a general uptick over time. President Trump's discussions of immigration probably did influence at least the way the centers talk about these issues. So a lot of times they will, I think we're well aware of this, they characterize his, for example, this was actually not 2015, but the Muslim ban, they will label it that instead of the fact that this was just a restriction on immigration from Muslim majority countries, but definitely it wasn't a Muslim ban because that should have included India and Indonesia then, which have very large Muslim populations. But I would think that it informs some of the conversation on immigration, but the uptick was there over time.
Great, thank you. Okay, so our next question is from Eric Bordenkircher, and he writes, do you know the name of the professor making the sizable donations at UCLA?
Yes, and this is public knowledge in terms of partially because of the public information request, but also there are articles in the Los Angeles Times detailing this, and the professor's name was Ann Zwicker Kerr. So I believe she was involved with the UCLA Near Eastern department, and I believe her inspiration for making these large donations was because her husband had died in Iran. I detail this a lot more in the report, but that was basically the inspiration behind donating to the Near Eastern Studies department at UCLA. And her view is that she wanted more understanding between the cultures.
Terrific. Okay, so our next question is from Jeffrey Fine, and he writes, did you examine the major areas of research by staff associated with the centers?
Yeah, so that was a little difficult to find. So I would say not really on that front. I focused more on the courses and the subject matter that was being discussed and the outreach programs, along with the instructional materials.
Okay. Our next question is from Joe Kotinsley, and he writes, you seem to be suggesting that these centers moving away from national security issues is a bias. I am failing to see the connection here, and I am wondering if you can elaborate on what you mean by bias. Isn't it a very narrow, hollow view regarding the realm of possibility for MENA area studies? In my mind, as a teacher, my job is not to feed the national security establishment. It is to show students how to interpret, contextualize historical events in history.
Yeah, so I think the point of showing those, the image in the national security focus was to show, or terrorism, for example, was to show that the centers focus less on terrorism over time. I think part of the reason, though, was because many of the professors in the field did not, as you said, they didn't want to be feeding the national security goals. They opposed the war on terror. They opposed a lot of the focus on national security, and it was more focused. They wanted to move away from that, but instead of moving to areas like they moved more to social issues. They were more interested in talking about or deconstructing stereotypes against Muslims. And again, that's very broad, like Islamophobia. I think it's often used not as just saying there's discrimination against Muslims, but it's sort of any policy that we adopt, such as restrictions on immigration, or a Western country simply saying that they do not want to take in refugees is somehow Islamophobic, and not because they are concerned about issues at home or whether they can even take in those refugees, for example. So I think when I point the national security issue out, it's more, not only is there a decrease in a focus on national security, but some of the reasons that the decrease is there is because, or when they decrease the focus on national security, they're more focused on some of the social issues. I'd also like to point out that at least for the national resource centers, they have the federal mission to support American national security. And so it does become a question of why public funding is even going, not just to Middle East centers, it's for all of the national resource centers. Why should they receive special funding if they are not going to contribute to American national security?
Okay. Thank you. All right, our next question is from Sylvia Weiss, and she writes, is Qatar a major donor to U.S. universities? Do they fund Middle East studies chairs?
Yes, so I actually wrote another report on Qatar for the National Association of Scholars, and so that's also available on our website. Qatar is a major donor to American universities. They've donated at least $4.7 billion between 2001 and 2020. The universities that receive the most in Qatar funds have branch campuses in Qatar. So that would include Georgetown, Cornell, Carnegie Mellon, Northwestern, Texas A&M, and Virginia Commonwealth University. Do they go specifically to Middle East Studies centers? That is unclear, and at least in the UCLA data, that was not, Qatar did not donate to the UCLA Center. Are there Middle Eastern Studies chairs? I believe there is one at Northwestern, and I think there's another at Georgetown that was funded by Qatar.
Okay, so our next question is from Boris Havel, and he writes, is the concept of Orientalism and Orientalist study still controversial, or are new generations ignorant of Said and his teachings?
So I'd say they are not ignorant of Said or his teachings, partially because many of the courses that I saw do incorporate Said. They will either require readings of it, or they will have articles that talk about Said's point of view. I don't usually see articles that are countering his point of view. I'm also looking, what was the second part of the question?
It was the second part of the question.
It was controversial to have the Orientalist perspective. So I do think it is still controversial to have that. And one thing I've noticed about the centers is that they've shifted more towards the view that, the people who are best at studying these subjects are people who are from those places. And so they'd rather provide perspectives that are by people from those places, or they have cultural ties. I actually noticed this at a course at UT Austin. I believe it was called Palestinians and the Palestinian Experience. And it relied on the concept of lived experience by a professor who's from that area. And I think the problem with lived experiences is that the concept of that is that it's not always objective. And I think that was very clear when he used the term Nakba to describe the Arab-Israeli wars, which Nakba is a divisive term. It's not a neutral term. So I would say that the quote Orientalist perspective, I think it's still controversial.
Thank you. Okay, our next question is from Ernest Sternberg, and he writes, what are the actual federal requirements or objectives in designating these centers? Are there requirements or expectations for study of economies, military conditions, etc.? Is there any reporting requirements on the centers to see if they are fulfilling these requirements?
So I believe for national resource centers, they need to be teaching at least or supporting one foreign language or one of the modern foreign languages. And then they also offer area studies courses. I'm trying to think. Sorry, I have to get that question up here.
Do you want me to read it again?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so what are the actual federal requirements or objectives in designating these centers? Are there requirements or expectations for study of economics, military conditions, etc.? Is there any reporting requirements on the centers to see if they are fulfilling these requirements?
Okay. So I think I answered the first part. In terms of if there are any requirements or expectations for the study of economies, military conditions, I believe they are just supposed to teach languages and they say like different parts of the world and whatever's relevant. But when these centers were founded, the purpose was to strengthen American national security. That was the context in which they were founded. And I would say over time, that mission has devolved. They focused more on international education. But I think this is an example where a federal program has outlived its purpose, it's outlived its time. And so it now exists simply to exist and to take money. But is there any reporting requirements on the centers to see if they're fulfilling requirements? Yes, there is. And the database that I use to get this information, the International Resource Information System, they are supposed to report the kind of outreach events that they are hosting, the courses that they have, and what they're doing with the funds. So that is out there.
Great, thank you. Okay, so this is the final call. If you have a question, please type it in the Q&A box. So we have two more that are here, and then we'll go to the next one. All right, so this one is from Shlomo Dubnov, and it's a two-part question. He writes, did you explore centers outside of the US and how they get their funds? In other words, the bias and the anti-colonial ideology seems to be shared by centers worldwide. How do you explain this global trend?
Okay, so my report focused more on American Middle East studies, partially because I believe there was a report done in Britain for their centers, and I really wanted to focus on what was happening in American centers. If you're asking why is there this sort of global bias for anti-colonial ideology? I mean, I think it's sort of the trend in academia. It's something that's held, it's an idea that's held by the elites. I will say that I have another colleague who's actually looking into foreign branch campuses, and so he might be looking into this issue. But my report was particularly focused on American centers.
Thank you. Okay. Well, okay. So the next question is from someone who only wrote their last name, Luckman. What are the responses of the key donors and targeted users of these study centers to the manifestation of the seizure by activists?
So I'm assuming this question, or my interpretation of the question, is how are the donors to these centers reacting to the centers captured by activists? And my guess is they're actually okay with it. Part of it is because some of these donors are, they support what's happening. Like, I think that's part of it. And then for at least, UCLA, many of the people who were donating to these centers, I can't tell you for sure, but if I'm speculating, it seemed to be for cultural reasons. So as long as the centers are promoting their cultural interests, then I think they're fine with it. But I would say that for a lot of the public, this should be concerning, especially when it's happening at public universities, which have greater accountability to, or state universities, which have greater accountability to the state, and when federal funds are involved, because this to me seems like it's a waste of resources and a mission drift that we really shouldn't be supporting.
Thank you. Okay, we have a follow-up question and comment from Joe Cotinsley, and he writes, I took the course at UT Austin and later TA'd for it, titled Palestine and the Palestinian Experience, that you are referring to. The term Nakba was used because the course was taught hybridly in Arabic and English as an Arabic content course. Within the class, we contextualized this term and explained why it was used and how. Knowing this, does that change your opinion regarding the validity of your data? When conducting your research, did you only look at course titles and material alone, or did you talk with faculty members or students as well?
Yeah, so again, I still think the validity of my data is correct. I did look at not only program titles, but where I could, I looked at the course material, or sorry, not the course material, the descriptions of the titles. I would also say the way the professor introduced, this is something I didn't write in the report, but it is in the course syllabus information for that particular course at UT Austin. I believe he talked about a politician, a Republican politician, and it seemed very critical of it. And that course syllabus is publicly available. In my or through my research, I did make site visits. I did try to talk to professors and students where they were willing to talk to me. And so I did provide their perspectives in the report as well.
Great. Okay, this is our final question before we toss it back to Asaf. This is another question from Jeffrey Fine, and he writes, do you have any data on the growth patterns of the centers, i.e. graduates, undergraduates, doctorates, total student numbers?
I would like to have data on that. That was something I was interested in. And if somebody has a good source for that, I would appreciate it if you could send it to me. What we were able to capture was the growth or decline in the number of national resource centers that focus on Middle East studies.
Great. Thank you for that. So with the time we have left, let me ask my question as well. As you know, the Middle East Studies Association of America voted on the boycott movement back in March. Obviously, a lot of this relates to the funding and the functionality of these centers and whatnot. What's the public policy goal, really, that you guys are looking to achieve with the report now that you have unearthed more data of a lot of the symptoms and the trends that we've seen a lot? To Alex's point about China and of course other sources of funding, is there a movement? And I know you mentioned it in your earlier remarks, vis-a-vis holding the institutions accountable to the use of the money. And we've also explored, related to the boycott aspect, that are these centers violating the states in which they're located as a result of the anti-boycott law? Is that also something that you were looking at as it relates to the funding and the use and misuse of the monies?
Yeah, so regarding, I'm assuming you're talking about BDS here.
Yes.
I have another colleague that's focusing specifically on BDS at American college campuses. And so my research doesn't focus on that too much, only because he's focusing on that more. And so that will be coming out soon. I think you asked me what are some of the policy goals that we have here. And again, one of them is just increasing transparency and the information that's available to the public. And then the second issue is, at least for the national resource centers, it's questionable whether they should be getting any money at this point, just because the mission has devolved. And so again, just because you get rid of the funding for these national resource centers, it doesn't mean they will necessarily close. It'll depend upon whether the universities find it important to fund whatever they are doing. And I think they should have to justify why it is important. And I would say, like, those are a couple of our policy goals.
Good, thanks. Alex, do you have one last question before we wrap up?
Sure. I want to ask you about one particular line that I found very striking in the report, because I think it's something that is very much understated, and it was with relation to the King Fahd Center for Middle East Studies, which was located rather in an unlikely fashion at the University of Arkansas. You said the King Fahd Center reflects the modern shift in Middle East studies, in that it focuses on self-study and advocacy of Arab students rather than benefit to American citizens. And I think that this captures everything quite beautifully. And I was wondering whether you could elaborate on that observation any further.
Yeah, so that was actually one of my favorite case studies to conduct. I think that was the ideal, where we could get perspectives from administrators, from professors, on what they thought the contribution was from those centers, and also finding out issues related to foreign transparency, or foreign funding transparency. When I talked to some of the professors that were either affiliated with the centers or were aware of it, one of the benefits that they thought the center provided was more cultural exchange, and American students could get to understand or get to interact with students from other countries and vice versa. But I'm not so sure about that, partially because when you look at the things that they promote, it seemed very much geared more towards Arab students. I mean, a good example of this is actually a poetry contest that is partially supported by the King Fahd Center, where the award goes to a student of Arab heritage. And I thought that seemed a bit discriminatory, that this award only goes to somebody of Arab heritage. And, I'm somebody who doesn't have Arab heritage, for example. And so that means I wouldn't be allowed to even, I don't really have a chance of winning that competition if, let's say, I was a student in that department. And so that's why, I think that example captures how these centers are really more about presenting the Arab perspective, and it's more about the Arab students rather than just for being about all Americans, especially when these centers are on American campuses at the University of Arkansas. It's on it's a state university.
Great. Well, thank you for that, Neetu, and thank you for everything you've done in your presentation this afternoon. I know we're short on time, and unfortunately we don't have time to continue, but obviously I would like to have you back, your colleague back, more data that you guys are producing. We would love to continue the conversation. Above all, of course, I want to thank everybody who joined us this afternoon, and I look forward to seeing, I hope many of you, if not all of you, at our conference on the weekend of November 5th. Obviously, these are topics that are related to a lot of the issues that we've been tackling at the association. And of course, one of the reasons that ASMEA exists is because of a lot of the problems that we've seen in Middle East studies at large. So this is, of course, clearly a topic that we are all concerned about. As always, I want to thank my colleagues, Alex, Suzanne, Emily, for joining me this afternoon. Neetu, thank you again for taking the time to join us. I hope you'll be able to join us at a later conference. I know you can't join us this year. And please be on the lookout for future webinars where we'll be continue discussing other topics relevant to our issues. And I wish everybody a good day and a good afternoon or a good morning, depending on where you're located. And we will talk soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.